we just focus on the Bondi situation,
Sure.
could people predict that coming?
One is, was it preventable? The other one is around if the guards were armed and should they be armed in the current environment. We are dealing with a different beast.
The stabbing at the church. The police commissioner, Karen Webb, came out and declared it a terrorist incident.
When you move that over to a terrorist-based incident, so this is when you're dealing with someone who doesn't give a shit about their life, doesn't care if I push the button and blow myself up and half of the team. People may remember, I think it was around August 1991, and coincidentally to talk about it now is what we call the Strathfield shopping massacre. 6 people shot dead. We were chasing a young fellow who was doing about 14 armed robberies in the area. Quite a violent young fellow at the time. He was only about 16. And as fate has it, as we pulled into the servo, sure enough, the robber pulled in at the same time. September 11, 2001, I landed at Townsville. And I remember sitting in a hotel and I remember seeing the footage around the World Trade Center and just thinking, oh, it must be a movie. This can't be right.
It's weird, wasn't it?
And it was just phenomenal. And I was just glued to the TV thinking, you know, in terms of the risk assessment lives we live in these days, no one would have had on their risk assessment playing into a building. It just was not going to happen. And I often started thinking, well, if it can happen over there, it can certainly happen here. Some of the intelligence we were starting to get back is a person around Mustafa Chaka, who was charged out of Pendennis, had been picked up coming out of a training camp on the border of Afghanistan. Your mind started to wander and go, oh, hang on, what's he doing?
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Policing is a challenging career at the best of times. Different areas of policing come with unique pressures. I worked in homicide for the majority of my career. There was a lot of pressure associated with investigating a person's death. There was, however, one area of policing that I believe had more pressure than homicide. If you got it wrong in this area, the consequences could be devastating. I'm talking here about counter-terrorism, and today's guest, retired Detective Sergeant Peter Moroney, worked at the sharp end of this very demanding area of policing. He was a team leader in one of Australia's most significant anti-terror operations ever conducted on these shores. I'm talking here about Operation Pendennis. What was being planned by 2 terrorist groups was on a scale which is hard to imagine. Peter is going to take us inside that investigation and talk about his fascinating career in policing. Peter Moroney, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks very much for having me, Gary.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Peter. I know you've been busy post your police career, and I see your head pop up every now and then and talking about policing matters in the media. And of recent times, I've seen you talk about some very significant events that have happened in Sydney, and I'm talking about the stabbing at Bondi, 6 people murdered, and also the stabbing at the church and the pursuing riots from that. It's scary times.
Yeah, they're different times,
aren't
they, Gary? You know, I've been out of the police now for just on 10 years, and you look back and think, I don't think I'd step back into that career path. But in terms of where we are and where we sit, and there's a lot of information yet to come out around, let's talk about the Bondi one first. There's still a lot of information to come out. Look, and as you know better than anyone, that the early days of an investigation are just that. They are early. There's a lot of information to be sifted through. I've been asked a couple of times, two points. One is, was it preventable? And the short answer to that is we don't know yet. We don't know enough information about this individual. We don't know enough about whether or not any threats had been advanced or put forward. The other one is around if the guards were armed and should they be armed in the current environment. But again, as you and I both know, that if you do give a weapon to a security guard and for example, that security guard becomes overpowered, and let's put that situation in the event of Saturday evening at Bondi, then that perpetrator now has a firearm to move around the Bondi shopping centre and not just a knife. They are changing times, they're challenging times, and I think in terms of policing, I think they've got it harder than they ever have. And then we move over to Monday, which what often struck me with that is that in one instance, police hailed as heroes, thanked tremendously for the work they did at Bondi on a Saturday afternoon. And here we are on Monday getting pelted with rocks, bricks, and God knows what else can be picked up. But as I've said a couple of times to some media personalities, is that that's just life in policing.
Yeah.
You don't get to dictate what comes your way. But in terms of what actually happened with that young offender, again, still early days, 16-year-old, terrorism incident's been declared. But what does it mean for the larger Australian community? At the moment, don't panic. Look, we've been dealing with terrorism in its modern-day form in this country since around 2003 when I first started at the Counter-Terrorism Command. Our police and intelligence agency are fairly well versed now. We communicate with law enforcement and intelligence around the world. Take the dialogue from them. If they're putting out there to stay calm and remain in control, then that's what we should do. They're there for a reason. They have the intelligence for the reasons that they have it, and we should have that confidence in them.
Yeah, I think you summed up that nicely, because there's a lot of questions that come from incidents like that. But as you pointed out, it's early days yet. We don't know where this originated from. Could have been prevented. Very valid point. Just winding back on the security guard, because that seems to be the type of talk you hear on the street or in the pub, as they say, oh, well, the security guard should have had a gun and that. But we know that can complicate things even further, and I think you articulated that very, very well. I think a lot of people ask, and if we just focus on the Bondi situation,
Sure.
Could people predict that coming? And that's I'm going to take you deep into your counter-terrorism expertise, because I think that's the interesting thing with counter-terrorism. I'm not referring to the Bondi one as a counter-terrorism, but when do you know if someone with a mental health issue is going to commit a crime of that nature?
It's a cracking question, and I'd start with simply saying, and I'll premise it with, it's not solely and individually a policing issue. Yes, do people with mental health deserve to be in the community? Yeah, absolutely. We've come a long way. We don't lock them up anymore, and nor should we. We're trying to work with them. I have a lot of close friends, probably as you have, Gary, out of the police, that suffer tremendously from a lot of different mental illnesses. Now, can they function as a part of society? Yeah, absolutely they can. But to go back to the question you ask, is a lot of things have got to be considered here. So if he was, as it is claimed, that he had suffered from schizophrenia, was he under the medical guidance of a GP or otherwise down here? Time will tell. If he was that being monitored? Was he getting the attention? If he'd come off his meds, why? These are all questions that aren't up to the New South Wales Police to answer and police, so to speak. This becomes a health issue, a greater community issue. And as you probably know, mate, throughout your career, police get tarred with having to achieve all this themselves, but it's not primarily a police problem at all.
Yeah, and I know there's been a lot of pushback from police in a general sense, not over this matter, that you expect us to be police, but also mental health carers and all sorts of things like that. One thing that there's nothing happy that comes from the Bondi incident.
No.
But I think it's significant now that we've changed the way we respond to incidents like that, because and I know wind it back before the active offender, where the instructions from the police is to go in and resolve the situation. It was quite often contain and negotiate. And I'm glad we've moved past that, because as you've identified, the world has changed, and we've got to respond. What we're talking about there is policing. For a long time, there was a period of time when if there was an incident, it was about contain and negotiate, which 9 times out of 10 works. But because of some of the things that have happened, and a lot of them terrorist related, that doesn't work. If there's a threat, the police need to go in, and that needs to be their main focus. And we don't know exactly what's happened at Bondi, but I thought it was good to see police doing their job, going in and eliminating the threat.
Yeah, she's Amy Scott, I believe her name is. She's done a fantastic job, and you're absolutely spot on in terms of the old contain and negotiate and get the negotiators in, and we'll all sit around and camp this one out. But they were predominantly, in my experience, Gary, relevant to it might have been a family domestic dispute, it might have been a kidnap and ransom, where when you move that over to a terrorist-based incident, so this is when you're dealing with someone who doesn't give a shit about their life, doesn't care if I push the button and blow myself up and half of the team. And I'll touch on it as we talk, because before we kick the raids off in 2005, a couple of days prior, the police raided a terrorism cell in France, and they blew themselves all up with the police. We are dealing with a different beast, and we've got to police it accordingly. I've been in and out of America for about the last 18 months, learning about and dealing with and training with issues around protecting schools and universities, shopping centres from an active armed offender. And unfortunately, as we all know, America are probably well versed in dealing with that for a variety of different reasons. But I'm glad to see, I'm with you, I'm glad to see the New South Wales Police, and probably indeed most of the police forces around Australia, have caught up to that and the issue now is, well, we won't contain and negotiate, we'll go in and deal with that threat. And unfortunately, if that threat means being shot and killed, well,
that's the price, or what you sign up for.
Pretty much.
If you're calling yourself a police officer. But I think we're all horrified by that incident over in America where the school where they had police waiting outside while kids were being shot. So again, watching from the outside at what happened at Bondi, what's your take on the police response?
I think the female officer, Amy Scott, responded exceptionally well. I think she, as you and I know, Gary, if you go back a couple of steps, the intelligence would have been scattered, wouldn't have known the number of offenders, wouldn't have known what weaponry, if any, but went straight in.
That's the thing that I looked at and thought, because there's chaos in situations like that. You don't know what information she went in with, but got the right result. Let's move to the other one, the stabbing at the church. Now, the Police Commissioner Karen Webb came out relatively early in the first sort of 24 hours and declared it a terrorist incident. Can you explain to the public what's that about and how it changes the dynamics of the way the matter is investigated? Yeah,
sure. Look, in simple terms, what it does is it allows us to have a lot more power. Very simply, if, for example, we were to arrest a shoplifter, that we can hold them for X number of hours. I think it's generally about 4 hours before you got a charge, or you can get an extension of time up to about 8 hours. Forgive me on that because it's been a while since I've done that. But under the terrorism legislation, what that will permit the police to do is now hold him for 4 days without charge. Now, if they want to hold him for longer, they can extend that up to about 14 days through an application, I think it's to the Supreme Court, where a judge will have the final decision of can you or can't you. Now, the benefit of that is he is contained within custody. So, for example, he's not released out destroying evidence or being involved, if indeed he was to do that. It also gives us a lot more powers in terms of, for example, if we enacted a power, we can designate an area, so a local council area, for example. So if we take the Orthodox church that was attacked, if it was required, what we'll be able to do is the police will issue a power to say basically anyone within a certain radius will be stopped, searched and detained for whatever reason. So it just gives us an additional lot of powers, rightly so, to address a threat that otherwise we can't deal with.
Yeah, the powers that we've got in normal situations are not not as useful as the powers that we get when it's declared as a terrorism. What do you think the thing, and I'm asking you here and we're looking from the outside, I understand that, but what do you think would have prompted Commissioner Webb to refer to it as a terrorist incident?
She clearly has to have had the sufficient intelligence to reach that threshold in order for her to declare that a terrorist event, a terrorist incident. So there's certain protocols, certain bars, like we'll talk about reasonable grounds to believe and things like that, Gary. So there's got to be a certain bar that she needs to demonstrate that they can, in very simple terms, jump to enact those powers. Because if she can't, hypothetically, the powers are enacted, and let's say police seize a piece of evidence under those powers, and those powers are found to not have been enacted properly, then potentially all of that evidence that was found during it may fall over. So to answer your question very simply is Commissioner Webb was certainly satisfied to the relevant degree that that the offence was terrorism related and therefore exercised those powers.
Okay. All right. Well, we got slightly distracted, but when you were coming on and these incidents so fresh in everyone's mind, I thought that with your expertise, I think it was worth discussing it. Okay, we're going to talk in detail about Operation Pendennis because that's been described as one of the most significant terrorist operations ever conducted in the country. and the stakes were particularly high on that investigation. We're going to deep dive into that because I know you've played a big part in it, and it also, it impacted on a lot of people, and you're a member of a team, and there was a lot of people that worked on that. But I want to talk about terrorism investigations in a general sense.
Yep.
As you know, I made my career in homicide, and homicide always was you could play the homicide card. When you wanted surveillance, you could trump the armed robbery squad or the drug squad and say, but this is a homicide, blah, blah, blah. When you needed the technical, the tricky stuff, you could play the homicide card. We're from homicide.
I was trumped many a time by that card.
Yeah, we used it. We used it. But when the terrorism started to really kick off, time and time again, I was confused at the start, but I'm going, but we're homicide. And they go, bad luck, buddy. These guys are counter-terrorism. We started to understand the importance of counter-terrorist investigations. Yeah. But the role is completely different from homicide, 9 times out of 10, because the role in homicide, it's reactive. The crimes happen, unless you're chasing a serial killer, the crimes happen, and you're trying to find the person responsible for it, so it's reacting. A lot of the work in counter-terrorism is proactive. It's about preventing an incident occurring. So the pressure is on, and the mistakes are can be very high. Do you want to talk us through the difference in what you've seen with the typical type investigation, let's call that homicide, break and enters, those type of things, as compared to the pressures associated with counter-terrorism?
Yeah, very happy to. It was a massive, steep learning curve. We in what I'd call the modern day terrorism investigation, so anything post 9/11, so September 11, 2001, where the planes hit the Twin Towers and other areas in America. Prior to that, we had a number of counter-terrorism arrangements in the country that were, I would call, fairly reactive in terms of we would often train for a hostage situation, or we would train for a hostage situation either on a ferry or on a train or on a plane, whatever it might be. September 11, 2001 just changed everything in terms of terrorism. So the New South Wales Police, as it was then called, test my memory here, the Counter-Terrorism Coordination Command was stood up, and they were given a investigative component. Part of that, and it was I suppose I can say it now, was a fairly political tug of war between, in the early days, between ourselves and probably the Australian Federal Police. So under the Commonwealth law, terrorism is a Commonwealth offence, and Australian Federal Police have primacy over the Commonwealth laws. However, it turned out, who knows, but it was obviously a political decision. But also then what had happened is under the then arrangements, the onus of responsibility also filtered down to the relevant state state or territory policing authority, hence New South Wales Police. So at the early days, at the commencement of it, we worked jointly, and we always still do work jointly with the AFP. But what the model was it was the first joint counter-terrorism task force set up. So essentially what that contained, Gary, was 2 state police, so whether they were from New South Wales, ACT, etc. 2 state police joined within the AFP contingent, and they were housed out of the AFP headquarters, particularly here in New South Wales. Then under Norm Hazard, as I believe it was, back in the original day when I first joined, I was only a lowly senior constable then, but the upper echelon then said, well, we want our own capability. We wanted an additional capability over and above 2 officers joining with the AFP. So hence the Counter-Terrorism Coordination Command was set up. It was one of the first times that they attached an investigation unit to it. And when I come back, so I was probably only about 10 years in, I think then, 10 or 11 years in, mate, and I'd been over to Perth for the better part of 18 months working on, let's just say, on secondment in Perth on a commission. And I was looking for a home to come back to. Before that, I was only predominantly working in local area command station detectives. And I'd been told about this newly formed counter-terrorism command who had an investigation arm, and I thought that was quite appealing in terms of going back to dealing with, what you deal with at a station in terms of being a detective. Before I left to Perth, I had a taste of working with the New South Wales Crime Commission for a couple of years, and was always very complimentary to the manner in which they just got things done. It was then under a Commissioner, Phil Bradley, and things just happen. If you needed stuff done, that is the police that worked jointly with them, you got it.
I did many investigations with them, and it's completely different, isn't it?
There's no red tape.
In the police, it was report, knock back this, that, do this, tick that. Yeah. Then you go to the Crime Commission, Phil Bradley. Yep, that can be done. We've got it done.
Did you want paperwork with that?
Yeah.
No, they were really good. So we knew then, I thought, look, that sounded really exciting. It was new. And the first 6 months, I was lost. I had no idea. And I think if I spoke fairly for all the guys and the ladies in the unit, none of us did.
Yeah.
We started off doing some investigations, and the very early investigations, we just attacked it with the normal mannerisms that you would attack a traditional investigation. Yeah. So what I mean by that, and you know better than me, mate, is that if we look at drugs, there's a very simple example, and we're looking to identify first and foremost through intelligence, is person A involved in the selling of drugs. The first couple of things we're going to look for is the telltale signs, numerous hundreds of phone calls on a phone, excess money that outlives his unemployment benefits, flash cars, if you do a search warrant, you know what I mean, mate, you're finding alfoil and little sachet bags left, right and centre.
Why the scales there?
Yes, yes. And so that all comes into play, and it's what I used to call the breadcrumb trail. Yeah. And I knew I was on the right path because...
Fair way of describing it.
All the signs were there. But counter-terrorism operations, investigations, mate, just don't run that way. And we found out, in essence, the hard way. So what I often found to be the real big difference is when you talk traditional crime, whether it be fraud, drugs, whatever, the offender is, and I'm generalising, geared or pushing for a monetary gain.
Yep, fair to say.
Self-absorbed, monetary assets, big house, red flag indicators for you and I to go, I think I'm on the right track. Take you back a step now and let's look at the terrorist. Fundamentally does not care about any of those things. Does not care about the house, so to speak. Look, they lived in houses, obviously. A lot of it was government housing. But the wealth side and that over-exuberant lifestyle did not compute with their ideology. None of that was there.
Yep.
Gone. The use of phones, and you know yourself better than me, mate, that when you lock up a criminal and then you've got to prepare a brief of evidence, and the brief of evidence, for the listeners that don't know, contains everything that we used or we relied upon to put that person where they are. A good criminal, and plenty of examples where they've shared their briefs in prison to learn, and they learn more coming out of that than they probably did going in. We then looked at, and so when the first days come up of, look, this person has, for example, as it was then, gone into 5 Dock Library. He's been seen to be researching how to make explosive devices. And that's it. Yep. That's the substance of your intelligence. And it's like, okay, where do I go from here? And the main difficulty that we had was traditionally, as you and I know, if I've got the grounds, I will perhaps go for a listening device warrant, or I might go for a telephone intercept warrant. I might even go for a search warrant. But all I have is, he might be up to no good, and that's it.
It's hard, isn't it?
And then you look at him and go, no finances, no money, no lavish lifestyle. I have an internet search. He's not at a hardware store purchasing items. There are no breadcrumbs for us to latch to and go, are we even on the right track? And I know I gave you a long-winded explanation to your question, but in essence, that is the main difference, is traditional crime, I'll find the breadcrumb trails, or most detectives will. Terrorism, in my experience, those breadcrumb trails are eaten up very quickly before you can get to them, and so you're often running blind until you can get in close enough.
Yeah, it's a difficult area of policing, and I think you articulated it well. There was a learning curve for everyone when it first started. I remember people were just being plucked, and I'm a counter-terrorist expert now, and they were learning. Certainly, over the years, it's improved, and they've got the skill set and understand the nature of the crimes. But the thing that always gets me with counter-terrorism and seeing the people work on it now, and the landscape's changed as you described since September 11. consequences are high. Like policing, we like to say we never make a mistake. Something comes across you in homicide. You didn't want to miss that crucial piece
definitely.
of evidence because that might have led to the solving the crime. But the scales are even higher with counter-terrorism. If you miss that warning sign, that indicator that I missed that, and something goes wrong, there's always going to be people going to be looking back and going, well, how did this happen? Were there any warning signs? Were there things that we could have done to prevent these things? Did you feel the pressure of that when you were working in counter-terrorism?
Yeah, I did in very simple terms. And again, probably because I was so naive when I first started in it, I didn't probably give it the credence it deserved.
Yeah.
But certainly, Gary, and I'm sure we'll go into it with Operation Pendennis, when it was moving forward and starting to move forward rapidly, and you're picking up those breadcrumb trails, you're picking up the chemicals, the weapons, the guns, the bullets.
It's all starting to come
It's
together.
all starting to come together. That was probably one of the oh shit moments. I don't want to miss this. One, obviously, for the devastation and the fallout that would come for it. But, you know, you as cliched as it might sound sometimes, you join the job to make a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
And by you missing that and people being killed or injured is just something I don't think you'd really live with.
Well, that's the pressure I'm talking about, Peter. That's the pressure that comes with that nature of that work. But look, before we get you in as a team leader on Operation Pendennis, the policing, was it always going to be your path, given the fact the name Moroney is fairly well known in New South Wales Police because your father, Ken, was the commissioner for, 7 years, I think? 5 years?
Thereabouts, Gary, 5 years, yeah.
And he was always thought very highly of you. Cops being cops, we always talk about different people. So, yeah, I don't think you would have been ostracised as Ken being your old man. But were you always going to be a cop? Was it a police family?
Mate, my first ambition, if I'm honest here, was to be a jockey. But at 6'4",
I don't know how to break this to you, Pete.
I agree that idea. Yeah, look, I think from an early age is that. Yeah, I remember being in high school, and one of the telling moments for me was people may remember, I think it was around August 1991, and coincidentally to talk about it now was what we call the Strathfield shopping massacre. 6 people shot dead.
I was referencing that when people were mentioning that hasn't happened before.
Correct.
I remember that one, yeah.
You know, and so Dad was at the relevant time, I think he was the Assistant Commissioner in charge of a region being the Liverpool Strathfield region. And I distinctly remember I was still a young fellow. I think I was just on 18 at the time from memory, and just come home from playing football. And the old boy was there, and I was having a chat to him, and phone rang, as it often did. Went quiet for a while, and he just only muttered a few words of how many dead. Okay, in terms of is he dead? So I assume he meant the killer at the time. And off he went. And that was probably the extent of my experience with Dad. He was constantly gone, and that's not in a disrespectful way. That was just the nature of the job. And I think that was my first probably, it sounds terrible, true taste of, okay. And just seeing him shift and change and then go do what he had to do, and he come home. And I distinctly remember often, and being a father now myself, and I can probably understand why he did it, he rarely ever spoke to us about what he did or what you do. The odd time that would change is when we grew up out at a place called West Wyalong, and if a truck had overturned with chocolate paddle pops, they would come home. But I think that's statute barred, so we're all right.
Yeah, we're not going to come after you for that. You haven't been cautioned, you're right.
Mate, so it's and he come home many hours later, and I just chatted to him and said, "How'd you go?" And he actually started to tell me what had happened and what went on. And as we know, that I think it was Wade Frankham is his name.
That's right. Yeah.
Stabbed a young girl. He was sitting in a cafe, and he stood up, turned, and the young girl was sitting on the cafe table next to him, and he stabbed her. And Dad told me in terms of, unfortunately, she was still there when he was there, and explained what he'd saw, and he'd never, ever mentioned anything like this in his life. And it resonated with me, mate. And it was probably from that time I started to shift properly to go, I think this is, what I want to do.
How old were you then?
Oh, mate, from memory, I picked up an inkling that I'd probably like to join the cops in when I was probably still at high school in about year 11. my mates all know this, so they can't bag me anymore. And the reason I know that is I took up typing at high school, knowing full well.
Jeez, you were thinking ahead.
Knowing full well I had to pass the typing test. But mate, that would have been maybe when I was just on 18, perhaps, thereabouts. And I joined about a year later.
Okay. And policing, when you were in it, did you enjoy it?
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I absolutely enjoyed it. I had a ball. I started my career, first kicked off at Campbelltown.
Yep.
And then we moved over to basically Macquarie Fields Police Station, which is a neighbouring suburb. For some of your listeners that don't know, it's about in the southwest parts of Sydney.
Yeah, busy areas for
busy
policing.
areas, yeah, mate. They were in the day, and moved around a little bit and did a few stints in what we call plain clothes, so just some, not detectives at those times, but just the giggle squad, so to speak, we used to call it.
21 Jump Street.
Yeah, pretty much.
That type of thing. For people that don't know the show, what we're referring to there or what we're talking about here, quite often when you're in uniform, people get a taste of what it's like working in plain clothes, and they work on low-level crimes. They're not detectives, but they get to dress up and just get out there and lock some people up. Yeah,
so I got the start of that, and I went over and did that first 21 Jump Street challenge when I was over at Macquarie Fields Police Station, and I was part of a team that were just concentrating on break and enters and things like that, and that sort of gave me the taste of that investigation approach that I thought, I think this is me. A pathway for a lot of people coming to detectives. That, mate, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed my general duties policing, and one of the things that the old man always made sure that Mick, I've got an older brother in the police, another brother who's a special constable, my wife's in the police, my uncle was in the police, two cousins are in the police, my niece and her husband are in the police. So, not going to misbehave at the family barbecue. Yeah, there's a few of us there, but Dad was always very strong on never forget your uniform roots. Yeah, and don't forget how hard uniform policing actually is. So we used to have, he used to give us a little bit of stick that just because you're now moving over to become a detective doesn't mean you sit back and let them do all the work. And he was constantly a massive supporter of general duties policing. I think that's good advice, and we try to get that across here on I Catch Killers, because quite often we're talking about investigations, and you strut round as a counter-terrorist detective, I'm the homicide detective, and us just the GDs. They're the frontline policing. Oh, they're the ones, and anyone that really understands policing understands the respect that they should be given. And a good general duties police officer is worth their weight in gold. And that's where you learn to speak to someone. For the first time. That's when you get an array of delivering a death message, to dealing with a lost child, to dealing with someone who's intoxicated, to dealing with someone who's off their head on drugs. So it gives you a great balancing. 100% those skills, and I think there's a misconception with the public. Oh, they mustn't have done very well in the police because they're in uniform their whole career. And let's dispel that right now, because some people choose to work uniform, and it can be a very rewarding job and a difficult job. And some people have made their career out of it, and what they do shouldn't be diminished. No, you're absolutely spot on. A couple of mates who have been in general duties or uniform policing for the better part of 25 years, mate. They've never looked sideways from it. Love it, and wouldn't change it for the world. And to be honest, I don't think I could do that. I don't think I'd have the stamina to do GDs. When we're all like promotions and you had to move around and all that, and people going from detectives back into general duties and that, it would be quite scary. We do certain things in as detectives, but going back there and being on that night shift on the time, first response to a traffic accident, those type of things, and all the things that you're confronted with. When people call the police, invariably it's not detectives that turn up. We turn up later. It's the general duties, and they walk into straight into it. So. Yeah, and we saw a perfect example of that there, unfortunately, on Saturday at Bondi Shopping Centre. First one there, uniform. Yeah. No, we need to pay homage to the uniform police, so I'm glad we got round to that. So, okay, detectives, you decided that was your career path. Where did you work before you found counter-terrorism? Where were you working in detectives? I got my first stint in a permanent plainclothes position. So before you can become a detective, and as the rumours go, there is no gold badge with a detective, as you know, mate. We do what we call a plainclothes stint. So to do that, just for the listener's point of view, you've generally got to undertake what was called back in those days a bull ring. And so it's basically a grilling for several hours in front of a panel of 3 senior investigators, where you better be able to recite every piece of legislation you might want to use. So I started at Campbelltown, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. I'd still lived in the general area at that relevant time, so probably with hindsight, that wasn't the smartest thing, moving over to police and live in the same area. But I worked with an old detective there called Bob Morley, who's still with us, and he's a champion fellow, and he taught me a lot of basics.
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter if you've got a homicide, it doesn't matter if you've got a terrorism matter or a shoplifter, everything's built on a basic element of an offence.
Yep.
And that was it. And we did a few jobs out there. Probably the first job that really resonates with me is we were chasing a young fellow for doing about 14 armed robberies in the area, quite a violent young fellow at the time. He was only about 16. And as embarrassing as this might be sounding, is that we got a tip-off that he was going to go and knock over the local service station. So Bob and I raced out, and I looked down at the petrol gauge and went, Bob, we need a bit of petrol. We're going to run out. He goes, we'll be right. We're heading to a servo. We'll fill it up there. And as fate has it, as we pulled into the servo, sure enough, the robber pulled in at the same time. And he looked at us, and we knew who he was. And cut a very, very long story short, we engaged in about a 2-hour pursuit and ended on Nowra Bridge. Halfway through that pursuit, we had to drop our car to the side of the road because we ran out of petrol and get picked up to go down and arrest him. So from that time, I learnt to always have a full tank of petrol in the car.
No, the little tricks that you need to know, because whenever you need it, it's not there. But you mentioned someone that steered you in the right direction. I think that's crucial for detectives, that you have a mentor or someone that you can learn from, because it's you can read the textbooks, you can understand the powers of arrest and all the proofs of the offences, but you need that cunning of a seasoned detective to point you in the right direction.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And you can't. It's invaluable, isn't it? You're getting, like, Bob had been around for probably a good 20 odd years by that point, and you know yourself, mate, the amount of experience you can rack up in that time, and then to part that onto someone is what I always loved about the detectives.
And Peter, I like those local detective officers, because you go in Homicide, we worked across the state, so you'd be dropping in and you'd be virtually meeting everyone across the state on various jobs. But if you had one good detective sergeant in that office, it virtually set the standard for the whole office.
Oh, definitely.
And you could tell, and that bloke works there. These people know what they're doing, and it just permeates through the office.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they certainly lead from the front, so to say.
Okay, so counter-terrorism. You touched on how you found your way there. What was it that interests you about counter-terrorism?
I think for me back then, if I can take you back a little bit, my mum had been diagnosed with breast cancer a fair bit when I was still at school as a young fella. Probably, I was still at school about year 8 or year 9. I can't remember how old that is, about 14. Anyway, mum had a fight of varying cancers over the years, which a lot of people close to the family would know, but obviously with Dad being in the position he was, it wasn't too well known that Mum was sick. Yeah. Fast forward a little bit, when I started, my apologies, before I left to Perth in the police, Mum had come out of a stint of cancer treatment and was doing well, and I sort of wanted to be able to pay it back. So I set up a charity ride called the Cape to Coatinga. So basically it was me riding a push bike from Cape York down to Parramatta Park.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Bloody hell, I tell you. So anyway, mate, we were doing that. But the reason I tell you that is on September 11, 2001, I landed at Townsville Airport to start the drive up to the tip of Cape York. Pardon me. And I remember sitting in a hotel, and I remember seeing the footage around the World Trade Centers and just thinking, it must be a movie. This can't be right.
It's weird, wasn't it?
And it was just phenomenal. And I was just glued to the TV thinking, in terms of the risk assessment lives we live in these days, no one would have had on their risk assessment plane into a building. It just was not going to happen. So when I came back from Perth and that opportunity popped up, that image and what had happened and everything you saw after that really resonated. And I often started thinking, well, if it can happen over there, it can certainly happen here. And I suppose it was that romantic ideal of being able to be at the front, being able to be one of the first investigators to go into the unit and help with what it is and what we did. That was probably the real romantic notion of it. I know that sounds really silly.
I get it, Peter. Like you're looking for something that interests you, something that's worthwhile. And because they were in that rotation policy where they were rolling people out. If you've been to Homicide too long, you got to find another squad or that. I always thought it was all that, and it's probably a regret I've got in my policing career, because I think the dynamic nature of counter-terrorism, I love Homicide. That was my thing. But counter-terrorism, if I was pushed or had a choice, would have gone straight to counter-terrorism. And I tell a lot of people that I've seen people in Homicide, they're burnt out for whatever reason, or it's just not gelling with them. If someone asked me where to go, I go Homicide. But if I wasn't going to Homicide, counter-terrorism. And the way that you relayed that, when you're doing police work, it impacts on you, but you want to be doing something that feels important and worthwhile. So.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's funny, it's when I first joined, for me, the gold star was Homicide. And that was where I was always going to hopefully end up. But obviously that didn't happen. And that was probably, if I'm honest, one of my regrets, is that I never actually got to go to the Homicide squad and worked on various homicides throughout your career. But to live and to breathe that, for me, that was the gold star when I first joined. I thought that's the bar that I've got to hit.
Yeah. Okay, so you're there. You're in counter-terrorism. How long were you working in counter-terrorism before Pendennis started?
So we kicked off 2003. I think the squad set up in late 2002. Yep. So we, at this relevant point in time, we were at North Sydney. We still had our two officers, Steve Ashton and Dave Garwell, who are both now out. They were our first two into the fray with the AFP, and they were based over at the AFP. So we were set up at North Sydney under the leadership then of Derek Shagan. Derek's now a good mate of mine and a very good operator.
He's a good fella, Joe.
Yeah. So we started there, and after about probably 6 to 9 months under the New South Wales structure for dealing with counter-terrorism, New South Wales Crime Commission come to the fold. So what they did then was they moved the investigative cell across to New South Wales Crime Commission for us to work in with their intelligence capabilities and their assets. So we started there full time, probably early 2003.
And working as joint with AFP?
AFP were up in their building with two of our personnel because of the structure basically said, yes, AFP, from a Commonwealth perspective, have carriage, but there were some aspects of the legislation that was put in place that said, and I'll paraphrase this obviously, but each state and territory is responsible for your own, over and above the joint counter-terrorism model. And hence, that's what we did. So we went that way. And that's where we set up down there. And we started to then attack it, no different, Gary, to what you would do with a homicide. So we set up structured intelligence, working in again with ASIO as well. And that's sort of where it was first started and where it was first born. And we were still making a stack of mistakes. And it
was new territory for everyone. Yeah. It was a new style of investigation, new setup, and I remember that because you would be talking to people at counter-terrorism, and some would be walking around going, "I'm not really enjoying it. I'm not sure what we're doing," and that. Others just sort of bought into it. I remember Dave. You mentioned Dave Gall. He went from homicide and counter-terrorism. He never looked back, did he?
No, and Golly was the team leader for me in Pendennis, and he subsequently got a book coming out. So all the best to him, and great fellow. And but he as he will tell you, as Derek will tell you, that it just was new. Yeah, everything we thought we knew, throw it out and start again is essentially what we did. Yeah,
well, I think it's a good description of how you set up, because watching from the sidelines and knowing people in there, that seemed to be how it was. It was sort of feeling your way, and
definitely,
it's the tests come. Operation Pendennis. And if I've got it right in what I understand, it started from a piece of information with a couple of blokes riding motorbikes suspiciously around the nuclear reactor in.
That's where what everyone become to know as Operation Pendennis started. Yep. But Pendennis, so Operation Pendennis at the relevant time, the name by the True Strike Force name was run predominantly. That was the name given to the Melbourne AFP joint operation. Okay. Up here, we were running, our target ended up morphing into them. So hence they all took on the name Operation Pendennis. But you probably got to rewind several strike forces. So you go to Fahim Lottie, who was the first locked up by the AFP team. So basically...
And take us right through it, Peter, because I think, and it's stuff that's public record, that's been to court and all that, but take us through it, because I think people will be fascinated by how it built up and what it became.
It's, there's so many spider webs to it. It's ultimately, if you think of Pendennis as the perfect storm, so what I'll tell you about is all the bad weather cells that come together to get us there. But in briefly, when we first started, we had a operator coming out of Indonesia, two twin brothers who weren't arrested, so I won't name them, but they come over from Jamar Islamir side of the house and had a number of JI contacts and were on the peripheral of some of the Bali bombing issues. So they come out and look, the predominant area, the geographical area that we operated in was that southwestern Sydney area, the areas of Lakembra and Bankstown, Greenacre, etc., because that's just where these people were happened to be housed. So they come over, these two brothers, and the more you looked at them, yes, they had JI contacts, but then they had contacts with other people here that have subsequently been arrested, and those persons had Al-Qaeda contacts. These other cells just started, not cells is not the right word, these other tentacles. And all of these connections started to pop up. And some of the intelligence we were starting to get back is a person around Mustafa Chaka, who was charged out of Pendennis, had been picked up coming out of a Al-Qaeda training camp on the border of Afghanistan. So I'm talking way back in 02, 03.
Okay, so this is the
early days. So we set up a number of separate little strike forces. I had one that was run called Operation Strike Force Fenders. We had Strike Force Hemley. And it's Strike Force Hemley that initially started to look at what we'll call the predominant number of the Sydney cell. They had a number of affiliates that came over in terms of one of the strike forces I had, and they had a number of other little spates that we'd set up strike forces to capture them. But in essence, you could throw a blanket over them because they're all interconnected but all doing different things. And I suppose this comes back to our inexperience at the relevant time. What had happened was we set up in a policing silo, which is just the wrong thing to do. So what I mean by that is we set up Strike Force Hamley that looked after, let's say, 6 targets. The AFP Joint Counter-Terrorism Team took 2 of those targets from the cell and they set up under their banner. And we know ASIO were working on the others. As silly as it seems, you would think we all do talk to each other, but we also are strung by legislative issues around the sharing of intelligence, particularly from an intelligence agency. And we policed in a silo. So if I could put it in the most simplest terms is, if you and I were engaged in a drug distribution cell, you had Bankstown, I had Lakemba, by way of example. One organisation looked at you, the other organisation looked at me, but we didn't have compatible systems. You know what it's like. Eagle Eye didn't talk to Promise, which is the AFP case management system. You had your own corporate responsibilities to deal with the gathering of intelligence, the storing of intelligence.
So you got these law enforcement bodies operating in isolation of each other. As much as we say systems are set up to share, they weren't.
Yeah, look, we had officers within the AFP, and as you could probably understand, is the AFP are responsible for corporate capturing all their information. We in New South Wales Police, we need to capture ISA. So we run Eagle Eye, as you know, Gary, with a case management system. But we still needed it on our systems as well. And then Crime Commission needed it on their systems as well. And it's like going, well, is it a Crime Commission report or is it a New South Wales report? And can I share that to the AFP? So all of those little nuances.
And it sounds ridiculous what we're talking about, but it does impact on it, doesn't it?
It does.
Can I provide you? I'm not sure if I've got the authority to provide you this information. That type of thing. And
then you lay over security clearances. You know, are you negative vetted, positive vetted, negative, positive vetted? And it's like, what on earth is all this? Yeah. So basically, before Pendennis started, if we start to think about it for your listeners, is that I have 1 or 2 people here that I'm looking at. I have connected through association. So all of our players attended a particular prayer hall. Yeah. And that's sort of what made them that connection, along with many other people.
Okay.
That the other people that attended there, and just because you attended didn't mean that you are that way, but we knew this particular prayer hall had taught a certain dialect, not a dialect, that's silly, taught a certain version of Islam, but this was an extreme version.
Okay.
With extreme interpretations. So if we looked at that and we said, okay, well, that's the honeypot in the sense that we know that if you're within this prayer hall, there are certain commentaries, certain views you hold about either the Western world or whatever it might be. So that started to become our understanding of, okay, is that perhaps breadcrumb one?
Mm. And you're talking with the views, extremist views?
Extremist views, yeah, mate. They simple things. And back in the early days, again, and this is sort of where we learnt is that just because someone said, bin Laden was a good guy, it doesn't make him a terrorist.
Yeah.
But the amount of intelligence reports we got coming in, I went into a house and I saw bin Laden. It was like, okay.
Okay, that's
as in a picture
closer.
of bin Laden, sorry, not actually.
Oh, right.
So we basically had these little cells, these little policing cells set up to target these individuals, because the only time they'd actually come together was in the prayer hall. Then they'd disperse. They might occasionally catch up. So here we had Khalid Sharif, who's probably more infamous than most of them, and he's now dead. He's the fellow that had the two heads of his sons who held up the heads in
charming character.
Yeah, overseas in Iraq, since dead. And then we had other players that are all still inside: Muhammad Elamar, Khalid Sharif, Khalid Chako, and moving on down towards Omar Jamal, Abdul Rakib Hassan, and two others come very late. So they were being looked at to varying degrees, or when we had the JI brothers come over, they attended that prayer hall, and then there was some outside association with one or two of these people and the groups that we were looking at. So there started to be what we call a little bit of smoke bubbling away. Yeah. But we still policed them separately. We learnt the hard way, but I was still looking at my targets. A couple of guys were still looking at theirs. AFP looked at theirs. Melbourne looked at theirs. It wasn't until that incident that you rightly talk about that it happened in, I think that was early 04 from memory, that Muhammad Elamar, Abdul Rakib Hassan, and the other fellow's name escapes me, Mazantuma, were out at around Anstow. Yeah. On the premise of test riding a motorbike that one of them wanted to buy. Some calls had come in that the fellows were out there riding a motorbike without a helmet. So the local police responded and dealt with the issue, tagged it. What a lot of people didn't know, we had tagged all these people. So if a police officer looked up Gary Jubelin, it would get flagged.
Contact you.
Yeah, they'd contact and say, hey, this is what's happened. So that happened. And as it turned out, I'd been working feverishly on my investigation. I think I'd just come back from Lebanon. I was over in Lebanon and Syria working on a matter. And I was going to a family picnic on this day. And to this day, I drove past where the police had them on the side of the road.
And we're talking, this is Lucas Heights area.
Lucas Heights.
Near the nuclear reactor.
And I looked across to my wife, and obviously my wife didn't know who on earth I was looking at, but I said something similar to, I know those guys, and she just looked at me, and I probably won't repeat what she said, but I was like, you better just keep driving. So we went off. But that's essentially, that and a few other little things is where it started to pop up to go, we are now going to pull them all under one big banner called Operation Pendennis, and that's when the name morphed. So Hamley and a few other smaller strike forces that we initially kicked it off in New South Wales was morphed up into what became Operation Pendennis. Okay,
so you set up, and I'm not asking for methodology or whatever, but what the public already knows. So you've got all these groups, you've got these, let's just call them people that there's reason to attach some suspicion to them or concern. You've got them meeting. You've got these different law enforcement bodies looking at them individually to start with, but then the catalyst was that meeting with the three of them together, and you've decided to come together. Still, there hasn't been an offence committed.
No.
It's just, and this is the difficult, tricky part about counter-terrorism. This is why I find it so fascinating. So they might have an ideology, but that's not a crime to have an ideology.
No, it's not, is it?
So you've got to just tread carefully, and you've got to gather evidence. How do you go about gathering that evidence?
Very slow and very painstaking. It was one of those things that we were, if I take your listeners back just a step, we're working on another individual who I won't name because he hasn't been charged with anything, but we picked up from some intelligence, and I'll just plant the seed with the viewers to say this person had served from prison time. This person had been convicted of some shootings within southwest Sydney, drug dealings.
Yeah.
So we knew he had a propensity for violence. And one of our biggest fears was if those people of that kind get brought over into the extreme Islamic side of the house, then that's going to be a very dangerous combination.
Okay, so that's when ideology can become actions if you bring in the...
Yeah, you're right, Gary. And also because they then come with the ability and the connections to reach into organised crime and extract weaponry, whatever they need. True. So this one fellow, and just going to that point you validly make, is that we knew something was afoot. He had been researching bomb-making materials. We'd picked up that he had recently purchased a boat, and we'd identified that boat. But one of the strange things is what we started to learn over time, or relearn as investigators, is the individuals we looked at became creatures of habit. Yep. So what I mean by that, they had already built up a hate for the West. So we knew that they didn't really travel out of their local government area, if you can call it that. But on this particular night, look, we'd already planted probably enough electronics around this guy to light up a Dick Smith store. So
you stole all my surveillance and electronic surveillance,
I took all your
physical.
electronics,
Thanks very much, Peter. That case is still unsolved.
So we had that well tricked up, mate. So we knew that the vehicle had tracked its way around a number of Sydney Harbour vantage points. And what had happened with that is when it was coming up to Christmas, New Year 04, and we overlaid it to the vantage points for the fireworks, and there was stopping at each of the key vantage points, and that then started to resonate with a bit of a problem that what's he doing?
Did you guys put it together at that stage? Like that's you could make a lot of interpretations, but were you thinking to New Year's Eve? Were you thinking to that? What was the thought process going through your head? You know yourself, you
try to let the evidence take you to where you need to go. You don't want to go, hey, this is what that is, because you know better than anyone, mate, that investigators can make mistakes, and you just try to diligently look at all the things. But yeah, you're right. Your mind started to wander and go, oh, hang on, what's he doing? Because creatures of habit and 6 or 7 months of tracking data never had them out of the geographical area. But now...
Change of pattern.
Why is he going? Perfect. Change of pattern. You think this is not right. So that heightened their senses. So we ran an operation on New Year's Eve 2004, but that sucked up probably half the resources of the New South Wales Police. We had a fear. We found out he had 2 boats.
Well, Peter, now that you've explained it, why I could never get any resources around that time. Don't worry about me. I was just running a murder investigation. It's
probably called payback, mate, all the times you'd stole them off us.
True.
But it was, so cut a long story short, look, we were missing a boat. So there was concerns around that. And I talk about that in the sense that started to help us understand how we look at these people in terms of where do we get our evidence from? How do we turn information and suspicion into any actual tangible evidence? And that's when we started to understand a lot more about how they operate. We started to understand that they were what we'll call those creatures of habit that did not generally drift outside a pattern. We started to understand, look, we knew these individuals, and I must say that it was such a small fraction of the greater Islamic community. 99% of that community are fantastic. And it was these small fringed elements that were involved. We knew they hated the West. We knew they espoused hate against us. And we started to pick up, particularly with 1 or 2 of them, that they would often go online and move over into gaming areas. So they might move into an online game and chat, thinking that they could get around our intelligence and it'd be safe. So going long-winded, back to your very good question, mate, was that we started to have to relearn what we looked for. we could no longer look for, the piece of alfoil or the hash pipe or anything like that. This stuff didn't exist.
And that's where I do find it fascinating, Peter, because it is changing the way that we adopt the traditional form of policing in the investigation work. And I'm very interested in the dynamics of the group of people working, because I work with seasoned homicide detectives. You can put us all in the same room and we'll have differing views, and we all knew our stuff. You've got people that have all come together. You're all learning it. Was there pushback? Were some people going, "You're wasting your time," or without naming names? Was there the dynamics like that? Was it robust? Let's say.
Yeah, it was. It was absolutely, and in parts, if this might sound a bit silly, but robust in my own head, going, "This is ridiculous. What are you thinking like this for? This doesn't happen." And on a particular night, this is leading up to 2004. I was heading home, and I just did a drive past of the target's house, and he was towing, how we picked the second boat, he was towing an entirely separate boat that we knew he had, and we knew we had no electronics around this boat. And I drove down the street, and my then Sergeant Matt Riley at the time, I'm thinking, don't I? If I ring him, I'm going to sound like a real idiot. He's going to go, "What are you doing? It's Christmas, go home." So you absolutely doubted yourself, and in terms of, trying to talk to other colleagues and go, "Well, do you think 1 and 1 is equaling 2, or have I just misread it?" And
well, I could imagine the conversations having as you're going up the chain of command, and you might hit someone goes, "Look, I don't think there's anything in it," or you might have all these counter reviews and sometimes informed decisions, and they've got to make a judgment call. Like, you're pouring all these resources into this.
Oh, definitely.
I'd say it's more than a hunch. You've identified clearly and articulated why you got your concerns, but there could be something else, and there might be some poor homicide person phoning up and saying, "Hey, I need the surveillance team," and no, we can't have them because you've got the surveillance team.
Yeah, look, and it was a big learning curve, but over time we started to understand the targets better. And look, this is easy to do in the sense that we had them saturated with electronic surveillance, so we had all their phones. So, Gary, it come to the point where part of the work I did, if I deviate quickly sideways, was I had what they call the Mick O'Brien Scholarship. So part of the work I did overseas was to learn how to target and turn Islamic extremists and flip them as what you and I would call an informant to go and work for us. And I learned a fair bit around that, about that process, in terms of really understanding who your criminal is that you're working on. You'd know that better than anyone, knowing how they think, how they move, down to the simple things of how many sugars they might have in a coffee or whatever it might be.
So important to have that.
You learned everything. And so then by understanding them, any nuance outside of the regular behaviour started to go, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And that's probably how we relearned ourselves, to probably broaden our mind a little bit more.
Well, you say broadening your mind. I was always impressed speaking to the true counter-terrorist type detectives, and they had so much understanding about the ideology and all the religions and everything, because you needed to. Just like in any other field of policing, you needed to understand who you're coming up against, and that's what sort of came out from that the squad with the people I knew.
Definitely, mate. Look, my wife, I started to read the Quran. I started to want to understand certain things. I researched as much as I could possibly research around terrorism incidents, and one of the main things for us is we took on in the early days the lessons learned from the US around terrorism. But why that did not work for us is we have a whole different social structure in Australia, a whole different welfare structure. So a lot of the learnings that I did when I studied overseas with some of them, I was very fortunate. I was in the US, Canada, Egypt, France, then back around to the UAE, over into Northern Ireland, and we're just trying to get an understanding of how they operate. But the whole thing that for us was that in the States, by way of example, they weren't on the welfare system that we were on. So their terrorists were committing what we'll call white-collar crime, fraud crime, like small frauds. And what that did was started to flag for the particular agencies in the US, they might be up to something because there might be a fraud here or a small fraud there. And that then allowed them to police them traditionally, lock them up for traditional crimes and put them away. Yeah. But our guys didn't do that. Now, I'm not saying the only reason they didn't do that, but most of them were on welfare. didn't work, didn't have a job to go to.
So that
in government homes.
And that takes your option out, because quite often if organised crime stuff, you move in and you charge them with an offence just to take them out of play.
Absolutely.
And with counter-terrorism, your priority is to prevent an incident happening, so that's an option. But if you haven't got that option because they're not committing offences, look, we're going to take a break,
Sure.
Peter. We'll when we come back, it's a fascinating tale, and I really like your take on the difference, the nuances of counter-terrorism, and I think you're giving people a real clear understanding of what it's all about, because it's not black and white, it's not straightforward. There's so many different things that come into play. The actual operation won't give away the end of it, but it's just fascinating. And I want to talk to you also about the impact it has on you, because
Sure.
we'll raise this when I get back, but going to the ultrasound for your child, you're a disgrace.
Yes, I know, mate.
All right, we'll be back shortly.
Thank you.